Hello, everyone. Welcome to our beloved church. My name is Davie. This is my second time hosting the show, and the last time we were talking about the separation of church and state with Brother Jay, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot from that. I got a lot more than I expected to get out of that just by hosting this program. So it's a real privilege to be here today and to be talking to Grace Mackintosh. And Grace Mackintosh has a lot of really interesting information to share with us today. She's going to be talking about a lot of interesting things like conditioning, hypnosis, suggestibility, free will, and what this means for the end of days and for the way we interact with media and culture and the way we raise our children. And Grace is a constitutional lawyer, and she's someone who got interested in these topics a long time ago, many years ago, when she just saw the decisions that people would make, and people don't always act in their best interest. And sometimes people make very strange decisions and they seem to act in groups, right? We've all heard or maybe some of us have heard the phrase, the wisdom of crowds, but there's also the madness of crowds, right? We've also heard that phrase too, some of us. And that's definitely true, right? We've recently lived through events where people have been pushed to make some very curious decisions about all sorts of things, right? May it be the way they vote, the way they take care of their health, the way they navigate very important things. And a lot of times people do things that are overtly against their interest, and people don't always seem to think as critically or as independently as you would think, right? As you would think when given the information, when they're presented all this information, people still don't always seem to make the right decision. And why is that? And that's something that Grace Mackintosh has been very interested in for a long time as different events have unfolded. And this led her to the topic that she's going to be sharing today. So, Grace, if there's anything else you'd like to share about yourself before we start, you can go ahead and do that. And then you can go ahead and introduce your topic and we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Davie, for that um, great introduction. You summarized it very well. And over the last 25 years, I've seen a lot of changes in Canada, and my curiosity about what shapes normative values, why I'm not seeing a protest with the loss of freedom of expression, of association, freedom of religion, led me to study. There are three main contributing factors to normative values and the shaping of normative values, and that is family, as you would expect, education, and media. And there are rapid changes that have taken place in the last few years, and one can only question why. And I think we have a contributing factor with respect to the why in tonight's presentation. And it all starts in the 1800s and the turn of the 20th century with Pavlov dogs, and in Germany and Leipzig with Wilhelm Wundt and what they discovered. And that moved us to the early 1900s. We developed that further in the mid 1900s to today. So, is it all right if I share my screen now?
Yeah, go ahead and share your screen. And then I know you're going to talk about Pavlov and his dog. So can you
Yeah.
just introduce, like, who is Pavlov? We've all heard this, and some of us have heard
Yes.
the dogs and the bells. And, maybe some of us know a little bit more that this is a classical conditioning. And, this goes into a big topic about who was Pavlov? Who is this person?
Yes. So, Pavlov was a Russian physiologist, and he lived and practiced during the mid 1800s to he was wrapping up his work around 1920s and 30s, and he was paid by the Russian government to conduct experiments, and we associate his experiments with his dogs. And he did, in fact, conduct many experiments on dogs. And then he repeated all of that on mostly children. And you can find that on YouTube. You can find a video that he took. The first video, by the way, was in 1888. So these uh, scientists who were working at the turn of the 20th century and so on, they were taking video of what they were doing. So he's videotaped himself working with the dogs, and he videotaped his work with children as well. And it's just it's there to find it. So I do think that if it works, hopefully we'll get a video tonight. If not, you'll see a still picture. He surgically implanted little devices in the cheeks of the dogs to measure their saliva. As you recall, what we're told in university is that he would ring bells, stimulus, and then the conditioned response was that dogs salivate when they had food in front of them. But he didn't ring bells. He used lights and touch and sound. He used metronomes. Um, I mean, I won't say that he never used bells, but he used those other devices much more. They're in all his lectures, and he did that for a variety of reasons, including that you can use them to hypnotize as well while you're conditioning a response in the dog. So he was paid by the Russian government for all of his research. And the story is that he was underpaid and that the Russian government was shamed into paying him more. This is one of your top scientists, and they built a 2-story science lab for him to work in, and they sent him a little bit more money, and his life was a little more comfortable than it had been. And his research really was to understand how to condition society, condition humans. It was the application to humans that they were really after. And they used hypnosis. They wanted to know if hypnosis had an accelerating effect, what effect it did have. And they also wanted to understand how to create pathology, like mental conditions in people, how to achieve that. And so he is the basis for that. And there were other researchers at the same time. In Germany, there was Wilhelm Wundt, who's sort of the father of psychology, and he had a laboratory in Germany, Leipzig, and he had American students that would come and they studied there. Stanley Hall was an American student. He went back to the United States and he trained Dewey. We have the Dewey decimal system, and
Hmm.
he developed all of that and psychology, and and it was the smart. People have heard of the Smarties, you know, condition responses, children to study better math, reading, if you give them positive reinforcement and so on. That's all based on Pavlov, and to some extent, we've considered him to be sort of cartoonish in a sense, that it was harmless or innocent research that was going on. In fact, it wasn't, and it serves as a basis for what we see in media and screens and Hollywood and the music industry even today. And further to that, both Pavlov and Wilhelm Wundt, for example, were atheists, and they, through their research, you've probably heard that saying, we are the sum of all our, the stimulus and our responses to the stimulus. That is the sum of a human being, and there is no spiritual and there is no God. And they were delighted with the
Um,
results of their research, and
it's
they
sort of
really
a nurture over nature sort of thing, right? Like, give me a
nurtured.
baby and I can make you any sort of man type of thing, right?
Yes, and Pavlov said very boldly that he had a basis for it, that he could make a human being do anything if they would subject themselves to classical conditioning. He said he could take a man who was in love with a woman and make them in love with another man. Then he said that he could undo that conditioning and make them attracted to women again. He performed a lot of really interesting
Did he do that?
experiments.
Like, did he actually do those, or was he just saying he could?
I've never read that he did that. I've never read that he did that, but he worked a lot with children. So the famous case is
Hmm.
that there was a little boy and they created a fear, little boy, I don't know if it was dogs or what the phobia is they created, and then they undid it. And he had done so much experimentation by that time that he was very confident that he could control any human being, control them, and especially um, when he put his classical conditioning together with hypnosis. That created a very definitive and deep classical conditioning. So he had a basis for making some of those bold statements, but he was very happy that his experiments had turned out the way that he did. I will prove that there is no God. That is one of the things that he extrapolated.
All right,
And
so he started off with the dogs, right? But it didn't end with the dogs. The dogs were just maybe it started there, but then was it the Russian government that pushed to make this to extend this to human beings, or was this something that he wanted to do on his own for his own scientific pursuits? When did people come into the equation for these experiments?
uh, I could be wrong, so maybe I shouldn't say it, but my understanding is that it was a collaboration between himself and the government. So he would come with his results, and they used orphans because they did surgically implant into the orphans' cheeks as well these mechanisms for measuring saliva, and they also injected, a very distasteful substances for the negative responses. And with the dogs, we think of the bells and the food and the saliva, but he did more
Hmm.
than that. He did more than that. And I don't know if I should save it for the slide that's coming or if I should just talk about it now.
Let's go ahead and go into your slides and let the
Okay.
slides kind of guide the
Okay.
direction.
Let's see if I can. Oh, well, there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pavlov's research, the application, talk a little bit about hypnotism and the summary, and I will try to fit in as much of connecting the dots for today as I can. So we talked about Pavlov. Here's a picture of him, young Russian researcher. And it opened the window to the mind of human beings.
Yeah,
So
and
what
very
did he
fitting
really
that
discover?
this was all in the 20th century. There's so many crazy things that happened in the 20th century as far as
Right,
government
right.
experimentation and all sorts of just chaos that happened during the 20th century. This sounds very much like a 20th century thing that would be going on.
Yes, and the 1800s formed the basis for what happened in the 20th century. So, for example, in 1888, for the first time, there was electrification in the United States. So, 200,000 miles of electrification was put up in 1888. 1888 was the first time that there was. It was a clip of people walking in a park, and Willem once started his research in the 1800s, and so did Pavlov. And then as they sailed into the 20th century, we saw the results of this escalating because Tesla gave us the science to develop the screens and other technology. And I just want to say that what Pavlov discovered, he described really, really well. He described it so well that it was the basis for psychology and education from then on. But it wasn't until I'd say 20 to 15 years ago that we actually had the developed scientific equipment to understand what was happening inside the brain. So he described really well what was happening to the dogs and the little children, but what was actually happening inside the brain, we didn't understand until modernity, like
Mm.
after the 2000s. Then we really took some leaps and bounds. Here's uh, a quote. Men are apt to be much more influenced by words than by the actual facts of the surrounding reality. And here he's making an allusion to hypnotism because
Mm.
when people are hypnotized, you bypass the frontal lobe, which pulls all of the pieces together and understanding and morality, and you sort of dump all of the message straight into the amygdala, into the midbrain. And when we're responding to something that's been planted in us in our subconscious, which is what's happening in hypnotism, you'll respond to the directives given at that time. And a person can come with a stack of books and a stack of facts and reality, but it won't make any difference. They will respond to that hypnotism. They will respond to the directives that they were given, that was spoken into their subconscious. And there is a way
Mm.
to undo that. And it's sort of like if you've ever seen a drawing and somebody says, "What is it?" And you say, "Oh, it looks like a young woman." They're like, "Look closely." And then you see a craggy old man, in the
Uh-huh.
same.
Yeah.
Then once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. So there is a
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
to undo hypnotism, and once you see it, you can never unsee it again. But until that time, we are slaves to whatever was piped into our subconscious, and that happens during hypnotism. It happens during an alpha state, and we're going to talk about that a little later.
Yeah, that's an interesting quote. It reminds me of this book I read several years ago. I used to be really into self-help books, and there's one called Psycho-Cybernetics. Great title, by the way. It was called Psycho-Cybernetics by Dr. Maxwell Maltz. And Dr. Maxwell Maltz was actually a plastic surgeon, but it was kind of like a psychology self-help type of book, and it was all about the power of the self-image. And the core message of the book was that the human mind cannot tell the difference between actual reality and something that's vividly imagined. And the mind cannot distinguish between the two. It cannot distinguish between actual reality and that which is vividly imagined. And the book was all about vividly imagining yourself to be the type of person you want to be. And it even talked about like how professional athletes will imagine when they're not able, let's say I'm a basketball player, when I'm not able to actually be in the court shooting free throws, if I imagine myself vividly shooting free throws, my brain actually believes I'm really shooting free throws. And you can actually improve just from imagining it. And so it's probably using the same mechanism as hypnosis to bypass the frontal lobe to get deeper into the psyche. And I just thought that was interesting.
That sounds like the whole book was written around that sentence. It's a very powerful download, and I'm sure there's a lot of science to back it up, if you could
And I know
unpack
you
it.
want to talk more about you're going to bring up the frontal lobe throughout this.
Yeah,
So
yes.
before we move on, can you just briefly describe what the frontal lobe does and why it's important?
So, of course, the frontal lobe is here in our foreheads, and there are there's a lot that's happening in the frontal lobe that for the last, 150 years, we could just make observations. However, the technology has become so refined and so advanced that we can see into the frontal lobe. So there's several waves in that frontal lobe. There's the alpha wave, the beta wave, the gamma wave, which is very short wave. And the frontal lobe is responsible for our personality, our character. We have our moral filter in the frontal lobe. And also, what happens in the frontal lobe is you assess risk. You assess risk in the frontal lobe, and you also pull together all of what you're observing. So, if I walk into a room and I I see everybody's relaxed and smiling and having lemonade or whatever, I'm going to respond to that. But if I walk into a room and somebody's just yelled fire, I'm going to run out with the rest of them. It's what allows you to do that. So, for instance, individuals who've had a stroke in the frontal lobe no longer can assess risk. And one of the things that's very important to know is that if you've had a stroke or if you're or that area of your frontal lobe has been impacted, you still retain your IQ. These people are very intelligent. They just don't have the ability to connect all the dots anymore.
Mm,
And they didn't know what was being affected, why that was, until the last 15 to 20 years. And they could see in there, and it is the very tiny, it's a very short wave called the gamma wave. And the gamma wave is very important, and it's genetic. Some people, families have a stronger gamma wave. They're very literate people, and some families have a not so strong gamma wave, but you can strengthen it. But the gamma wave can be flatlined, and it can be flatlined in real life. And when it's flatlined, you don't reason anymore. And so, for example, if I'm driving and there's a car that cuts me off, my gamma wave will flat. It'll flatline. And my brain will force me to focus on that car, involuntary focus. And it will force me to focus on the car until I decide I'm going to pull to the side. I'm going to put the brakes on. If I just slow down, we're not going to have an impact. And it's the same thing that might happen if you were like all of a sudden on a path and a bear appeared, where you're going to go up the tree, you're going to run, you're going to freeze, you're going to fight. And it is that involuntary focus that is forced when your gamma flatlines. And what flatlines it is an unexpected change. So, with respect to screens, which we're going to be talking about a little bit further on, when you have a cut, pan, zoom, the flashing lights, the loud to soft, all of these frames changing within seconds, that flatlines the gamma. And the gamma does try to come back up, but if there's another scene change, the brain sees it as an unrelated scene and it's unrelated event, and it will force involuntary focus. And that's why most of us have a really hard time if we're in the middle of watching Avatar or something like that, which was really shot like, um, that we have a hard time pulling ourselves away from that. And I just want to say, I don't think children stand a chance. They don't stand a
mhm,
chance with screens. For you and I right now, it's just like talking heads. That's all related movements, or if you had a camera and it was panning a cat as it walked across, a counter and then jumped to the floor, that's all related sequences in
mhm,
behavior and what you're seeing. So you're not going to have your gamma wave flatline, but it does flatline with the screens. It also flatlines with drugs and alcohol, which is why we don't want people driving, because they lose their ability to assess risk. They don't lose their intelligence. People are very mistaken. Like, you don't lose your IQ. It takes years and years to lose your IQ if you keep abusing your mind. But what it does do is it takes away your ability to reason from cause to effect. And God says in the Bible, come to me and we're going to reason. He's clearly wanting to communicate with us through the frontal lobe. He doesn't want to hypnotize us. He doesn't want to force us, right? Because if you are hypnotizing somebody, then you can preach right into their brains. And whatever you say, it's there without any filter. And it is just as damaging to do that with, the medium is a message. It's just as damaging to do that with good material as bad material in the damage that it does to the brain. Um,
All right.
Obviously, that could
So
be a
the
whole another discussion.
Yeah, so the frontal lobe, it's this is the part of the brain that's obviously as it says in the name, it's in the front, right? It's the two lobes that are in the
Yes.
front of the brain that are responsible for personality, decision making, your moral reasoning, your judgment, and also your ability to kind of like pattern recognition, your ability to kind of see an array of
Yes,
information and to
connecting.
form a cohesive structure out of those things based off of seemingly disparate pieces of information and to kind of unify those
Correct.
things into one thing. So that's what the frontal lobe is, and it produces gamma waves, right? And the gamma waves are also very important in this process as well. And so these are important. This is an important thing to understand as we talk more about what Pavlov was doing and hypnosis and conditioning and how it bypasses this structure or even damages it.
Yes, that's right. It bypasses and it damages it. Absolutely. 100%. So Ivan Pavlov says in the dog, two conditions were found to produce pathological disturbances. So he was trying to create pathological disturbances. They were trying
Hmm.
to figure out how to create mental disorders by functional inference, namely an unusually acute clashing of the excitatory and inhibitory processes. So that just means positive and negative stimuli. So, and he says the influence is strong and extraordinary stimuli. In man, precisely similar to the usual causes of nervous and psychic disturbances. And he's talking here about cognitive dissonance. So, like, you have all this talk right now about, oh, cognitive dissonance is actually really good for you. Well, it is good to have choices, but cognitive dissonance is it means something different, right? So, he said different conditions. Productive extremes excitation, such as intense grief or bitter insults, often lead when the natural reactions are inhibited by the necessary restraint to profound and prolonged loss of balance in nervous and psychic activity. So he's saying this, but the study that he's basing it on was a study that they did with metronomes. So they use metronomes, light, touch, sound, all, music, all of these things were used as the stimulus. And then the
Hmm.
response that they wanted was mainly that the food and the salivation. And so if they did an excitatory is positive, okay, positive stimulus, they would set the metronome for 60 beats per minute. And then they would offer the food and measure the saliva response in the dogs until when the dogs heard the metronome, they would start salivating at 60 beats per minute. The inhibitory process was perhaps 120 beats per minute. And then they would present the food, but through this little device surgically implanted in the cheek, they would inject acid into the dog's mouth so they would regurgitate. So then when they hear the 120 beats, they are already starting to feel like vomiting.
Mm-hmm.
They're what he did was, first of all, he presented the positive and negative stimuli at the same time. This created a psychic disturbance. So the dogs were sort of like, they were freaked out. And it took maybe several days for them to come back. But what really disturbed them, and one of the dogs that they call it, the dog had a weak mind, is what they said. But the dog never came back. He sort of lost his mind and he never came back. They couldn't work with the dog again. And what they did was to play the 60 beats per minute and then the 120 beats per minute, but right after each other. So, like, if you can picture rock music, that's what it was. So it's like tick, 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 tick. And the dog positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, and then they just like their brains blew up, you know.
Hmm.
And so
And they're
this
purposely doing this to
this
create pathologies.
correct. So this lovely little quotation here is based on that experiment. And I mean, I don't know if you can see, can anybody see this? You can't. Sorry. Okay, so I have a book here. It's Pavlov's book. It's called Conditioned Reflexes. It was published in 1926, and it was his lectures, all the research that he'd done. And his last set of lectures were on application to man. And all of these experiments are, he describes everything in his lectures. And then it was obviously in Russian, and I have the English version. So that's what happened. So Pavlov studied dogs, and he wanted to install behavior programming. Then he repeated his studies on children. He studied the effect of hypnosis on classical conditioning or programming. And what he discovered was that if you hypnotize or put an animal or a person into an alpha state, which is a hypnotic state, you can very rapidly condition them much faster than without hypnosis. And it takes a lot longer to undo the programming. Pavlov also discovered that trauma had the same effect as hypnosis. And I hope everybody knows that MK Ultra was a program. There were experiments, and it was based on trauma. But Pavlov was, he's the first one that I know of that wrote about it. And so he found this out accidentally because so the dogs were in the lab, and they were kept in kennels and so on. And there was an unexpected pipe that broke, and there was this huge flood, and the dogs were traumatized because they were in the cages, and there was this flooding, and they were all mentally pathological for some time after the flooding, and they noticed that the conditioning was the same as if they had been hypnotized. Also, the mental pathology was there, the same as with presenting the positive and negative stimuli, one right after the other or at the same time. And I mean, I just think of those I'm sorry, I just think of those rave parties, and the music would take you up, like dun 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 dun, and then it would just drop you.
Hmm.
It's Pavlov studied that first. He studied the effect of that first, and then you sort of can preach whatever you want into the
Yeah, there's
mind
even
at
a
that time.
genre popular in raves called trance. Trance is a very popular
Yes,
genre. Yeah.
yes. Yes, there's a reason it's called trance. There's
Yeah.
a reason that it's programming. Anyway, Pavlov discovered that it was very difficult and in some instances impossible to decondition traumatized dogs. So trauma became a very useful tool. So here's a picture of one of his dogs. And so they had them because they had to stand for long periods of time. So they had them sort of helped them. You can see these little uh, ropes around their legs, sort of kept them in a standing position, and you can see the patches that have been shorn off the dog, to be more responsive to touch and so on. So apparently, in 1953, in November, on the BBC, a doctor sergeant indicated that the attack upon the mind is the most serious problem threatening Western civilization today.
Mm.
Dr. Sargent's talk dealt with the subject of indoctrination, and he outlined the developments of Pavlov's theories in the modern political world. Pavlov is, of course, one of the founders of psychopolitics. So it's very interesting. There's very few people that will talk about it in this sense, and people don't realize that.
What is psychopolitics? What is that?
Well, I think Freud's nephew wrote about it first, and his name will have to come to me. But he wrote controlling collective mind and using advertising to do that. But he talked about it in the context of politics so that you can, I mean, back then they didn't have computers, but it was like an algorithm so that you could sort of shift people's normative values into voting this way or voting that way. And to see the results of it, as I had uh, sort of mentioned in the beginning of the discussion in Canada, you see this rapid erosion of freedom of expression and freedom of association, freedom of religion. For some time, the University of Edmonton insisted they had a rule on their campus that if you were going to invite somebody to church or Bible study or something, you had to give them a warning. I'm going to ask you something that's religious. You know, you had to tell them because
Mm.
people are just so fragile that, and it's such an insult, that you might have something to offer them that's better than whatever they're experiencing right now. So it was this restriction on freedom of association, freedom of expression. And then how do you have freedom of choice? Like if you can't be exposed to other ideas, you can't, and that they don't have that rule now. I mean, it was very brief, but just as an example, of what's happened here, and I'm sure it's happened in the United States in different ways and around the world. So um, what's wrong with these poor creatures? Sokolov asked. What have you given them to make them so nervous? Zeleny laughed. This is our prize project. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov attributes great importance to it. As you know, he has proved that the central nervous system directs and controls all functions of the body in men and animals alike. But now he wants us to establish through a series of experiments that such diseases as cancer are also influenced by the central nervous system, or that neurotic persons whose nervous system is overstrained are much more predisposed to cancer than persons with a well-balanced normal nervous system. An ambitious project, Sokolov remarked. Quite. But we hope to prove that the etiology of cancer is in the alterations of the central nervous system. Well, this is the first step in that direction. I rendered these dogs neurotic. How? I was fascinated by using the technique of conditioned reflexes. First, by forming them with a bell or light, and then inhibiting them. This technique can induce a state of extreme neurosis in normal dogs. You can see yourself that they're neurotic, and they were indeed. Now, Zeleny continued, we shall see if a malignant tumor develops in these dogs. We might know in a year or two. It was to take more than 20 years, however, to complete the investigation. Not until after the death of Pavlov and Zeleny were the results published by Dr. Maria Petrova and other Pavlov students, partially confirming their master's theory. So, we've had some quotes that you and I maybe have been exposed to that a lot of disease begins in the mind.
Hmm.
There's also accidents that happen to us, like being exposed to radiation and, you know, other things like that. But a lot of our disease begins in the mind. And Pavlov was aware of that. There was so much malevolence, really, with respect to his research. And and we're just unaware of that. Here's another picture. Pavlov with his assistant and one of the dogs in his stand. And I think they posed for that picture because typically, like I said, they had these, you see the ropes here at the top. They typically had
Hmm.
them coming down and helping the dogs stay in a standing position because they were there for hours, the dogs. So here's a picture of a child. You can find these pictures on the web. So you can see the surgical implant in the cheek there,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and he's being fed obviously to some kind of condition, like some kind of stimulus. Well, Pavlov today is famous for his experience with the dogs. A little known fact, seemingly left out of every textbook the world over, is that the much honored Pavlov conducted the same experiments on orphan children, including surgically implanting the same type of saliva collectors on some of them, as you see in the picture on the right. Further, his experiments on dogs and humans didn't stop at positive reinforcement. He also experimented with negative reinforcement. Uh, this one says, such as flooding the dogs' kennels to make them think they would drown and shocking them instead of using metronomes or other human cues. I do I do remember reading that the flooding was an accident, but then they may have flooded it on purpose afterwards to recreate that. That sounds like something he would have done. Um, this is actually a video, but oops, I don't know how to. Oops, I don't know how to get back to that one. There, but I don't think I can play it. But it was a video showing him working with these children. So here you can see this child is lying down. He's hooked up. You know, it was just torture what he did to these children. He really did repeat all his experiments that he did on the dogs with the children. He did.
Yeah, that's
It was
horrible
in
because I never heard about that. I think most people have never heard about that, right? Like
no,
so
it's
we've heard about
inhumane.
the dogs, and even then, most
Right,
people just know about like the bell. They would ring the bell to
right,
make the dog salivate, and that's about
right.
it, right? That's about and if you know anything about Pavlov, it's probably just that, right? All this is like most people have no idea that the research went to this extent, and then even if you know that, most people don't know that extended to human beings, to orphan children.
These poor little orphan children. And so clearly, his research was intended to discover the effect of hypnosis on humans, how to control humans, how to create pathological disturbances. Like it was highly significant research that he was involved in, you know. So he writes, and I'm sorry that I don't have these the videos are very powerful. Anyway, the method of inducing hypnosis in man involves conditions entirely analogous to those which produced it in our dogs. The classical method consisted in the performance of so-called passes, weak, monotonously repeated tactile and visual stimuli, just as in our experiments upon animals. So it's doing the same thing. And here's this book. See this book, page 404, Conditioned Reflexes, Ivan Pavlov. And he's going to be lecturing and he's describing, in his lecture. However, if the reader skipped to the last chapter of conditioned reflexes for applications for man, they would find him discussing hypnosis. His experiments were specifically designed to demonstrate how hypnosis works. It was determined possible to produce by verbal suggestion uh, in sleep hypnosis. I have to just move this a little bit so I can read this. Not only hysterical syndromes, but also more complex pathological states, such as an epileptic fit. Reproductions of skin diseases by suggestion were performed as well as their successful treatment. This is going back to what you talked about, Davie, in the beginning. If you can imagine it, the mind thinks it's real. And I just want to say, I'm sure most of us have heard of experiments that were done. People were told this water is boiling, but the water is actually ice water. And then that water was dropped on the individual's arm, and the skin blistered as
Mm-hmm.
if it was boiling water. So like the whole body down to the cellular level was responding to the thoughts that that person had, right? What they were told. It goes exactly with what you were saying about that book by what did you say it was Maltz?
Maxwell Maltz, yes.
Yeah, Maxwell Maltz. The possibility of reproducing bronchial asthma by suggestion was demonstrated, as well as malarial syndromes. It was concluded that
Wow.
the phenomenon was based on real, actual reproduction of the processes which occurred in the subject's higher divisions in the cerebral cortex. They're always guessing, right? They didn't have the technology to see what was really happening. But he was a very acute observer, which confirmed the correctness of the Pavlovian school to the effect that the traces of past experiences are in a certain measure indelible. It follows the methods of psychocatharsis, during which the patient is forced keenly to relive the experiences which have traumatized him or her in the past, and of the hypnoanalysis reviving the memory of the patient who is in a state of suggested sleep, the fact frequently used by psychotherapists for diagnostic and therapeutic purposes, have a real basis in fact. So, the identity of inhibition with sleep and hypnosis by Ivan Pavlov. So that's another book. You can see where he was headed. He wrote a book on hypnosis, and there's his poor little dog set up for the studies. So this is a slide on hypnosis. This is also from Conditioned Reflexes, Application to Man, page 395 to 408. The fact that it's possible to suggest to a hypnotized subject almost anything, however little it may correspond to the physical reality, and to evoke a reaction in opposition to the actual reality, for example, the reaction appropriate to a bitter taste, when the reality is a sweet taste. This fact, I believe, can be compared with the fact observed in the paradoxical phase of transition in the dog, that weak stimuli have a greater effect than strong ones. And what he means is when they're hypnotized through soft music, through soft speaking, through soft touching, and then they receive the instructions, to their subconscious, this is more powerful than what is real. The real stimulus from the sweet substance going directly to the corresponding cortical cells should be expected to be much stronger than the substituted verbal stimulus of bitter, which goes through auditory cells to the chemical analyzer of taste for bitter, just as the conditioned stimulus of the first order is always stronger than the one of the second order. The significance of the paradoxical phase is not limited to pathological states such as those previously observed, and it's highly probable that it plays an important part in normal men too, who often are apt to be much more influenced by words than by the actual facts of the surrounding reality. I hope to be able to produce a phenomenon in animals analogous to suggestion in man during hypnosis. And he did, in fact, achieve that. So he was born in 49 and he worked till 36, but he lived past that. He's a Russian physiologist, studied hypnosis extensively, believed in the power of the word as a signal to bring about response. Just as a recap, hypnosis became foundational in Russian psychology. He did careful neurological experiments to find hypnosis as scat, sleep, excitation, and inhibition, which is positive and negative stimulus. I'm sorry to be reading so much, but if I don't read it, these are Pavlov's words himself. And
No, these
it's,
are powerful. These are good.
thank you. In the dog, two conditions were found to produce pathological disturbances. Functional interference, namely an unusually acute clashing of the excitatory and inhibitory processes, which was presenting positive and negative stimuli either at the same time or one right after the other, boom, 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 boom. And the influence of strong and extraordinary stimuli, like the flood. Okay. In man, precisely similar conditions constitute the usual causes of nervous and psychic disturbances. Different conditions productive of extreme excitation, such as intense grief or bitter insults, often lead, when the natural reactions are inhibited by the necessary restraint, to profound and prolonged loss of balance in nervous and psychic activity. So, too, neuroses and psychoses may develop as a result of different powerful stimuli. Example, extreme danger to oneself or to near friends, or even the spectacle of some frightful event not affecting one directly. At the same time, we know that the same influence may produce a profound disturbance in some individuals and show no trace of effect on others, according to the power of resistance of the nervous system in each case. Exactly the same difference is observed also in dogs, which show a great variation in regard to the production of pathological disturbances. I just want to stop here and say a lot of these school shootings, and when the stories come out, they come out very briefly and then they're whisked away. But it
Mm.
will, the parents will say, yeah, they were listening to, music that was violent, saying, go shoot the school, or they were playing these like violent video games of shooting at the school or something. And then, they're quickly removed. They're scrubbed. But a lot of different people listen to the same music. Not everybody's going to get a gun and go shoot the school teacher, or
Right.
they're not going to. But he is saying here, people and dogs that had a weaker mind, or they're more susceptible, they were affected, but some other people were not, right? So he says
Mm.
exactly the same difference observed in dogs.
Yeah, that's a common thing people will say, right? Whenever there's a school shooting, some tragedy
Yes.
like this, and if that ever comes into the conversation, the media that could have been influencing them, like games are a big example because games are notoriously super violent, right? Most games are. Most video games, you're killing something. Is it with a gun or a sword, or you're blowing stuff up? Like most video games, you're killing something, right?
Right.
But whenever the conversation comes up, the most people will defend the media, defend video games or movies or music and say, well, I played Call of Duty and I've been playing Call of Duty
Right.
for 15 years and I've never just wanted to shoot up a school, right? I've never desired to go and try to assassinate the president. I've never thought to do things like this.
Right.
But that's just because it doesn't affect you or doesn't, even if it doesn't affect most people and so powerfully in that way, doesn't mean that some people, perhaps with a less robust mental constitution, that it won't affect them, right?
Exactly. And to some extent, our normative values are being shaped, like our minds are like clay. So we're all being shaped with whatever we're exposed to. It's just that some people with like a much weaker mind, they're going to commit suicide, or they're going to get a
Hmm.
gun and kill somebody, or they're going to respond to it and act it out. And
Hmm.
and it really deserves a whole nother discussion, but it's a
Hmm.
very good point. We had dogs in which one of the most efficacious methods of evoking nervous disturbances, namely, see here, a direct transition from inhibitory to excitatory rate of stimulation of the same place of the skin, failed to produce the slightest effect after a great number of repetitions on many days. In others, disturbance occurred eventually after many repetitions, while in some it produced by a single juxtaposition of the stimuli. Okay, so they were, uh, when he's talking about um, tactile, he's talking about they were touching them. They also describe in conditioned reflex research that they did, which the metronomes were at 60 for positive stimulus and they were 120 for negative stimulus, and they played them one right after the other, like similar to rock music. And that disturbance also was very similar. Some of the dogs immediately, their brains fried. One of them they could never bring back. Um, and others, they had stronger minds, and they weren't as affected, right? In the same manner, the Great Flood, which, as was mentioned previously, led to a profound disturbance obviously analogous to traumatic neuroses in man, produce this effect only in some of the dogs, namely those of an extremely inhibitable type. So they're very easy to condition. So PTSD is frequently conceptualized as a memory disorder within a Pavlovian fear conditioning and extinction framework. According to this framework, multiple cues come associated with a traumatic experience forming strong sensory memories. So Pavlov is also the basis for modern therapy with respect to trauma. And I mean, there's a study that I know of that like 30% of people who did talking therapy got better. The other 70% didn't. But the 30 who got better, it was because they formed a bond with the therapist, and they were able to like go back and regain trust and build on that. But
Mm.
a lot of times talking can make the trauma worse. And this is all
Mm.
based on Pavlov's studies as well. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to say anything more, but I found that research interesting. So here's a picture of the flood that somebody has recreated. And the dogs, of course, were absolutely terrified because they were trapped in the cages. So the hippocampus is where explicit memories for facts and episodes are processed and fed to other brain regions for storage. The brain registers and temporarily stored event aspects in the hippocampus. Memories then migrate to for storage and memory consolidation process. Right and left frontal lobes store different information. The hippocampus and the brain cortex display rhythmic patterns of activity during sleep. And then trauma, my understanding, trauma is, let's see, the hippocampus is involved in explicit memory processing and contextual retrieval of fear-related memories. So that's where they go. And in this review, we use fear conditioning and extinction studies to draw a direct line from Pavlov to PTSD and other anxiety disorders. So Pavlov studied extinction in dogs, which means he conditioned them. And then extinction means he undid all of the conditioning. That's what he meant when he used that term extinction. And then he surgically removed their frontal lobe. And then attempts at extinction was observed again. The most important difference was that it could not be made to undergo extinction after the frontal lobe was removed, which occurs with extreme ease and in the case of the real conditioned water reflex, the flooding in normal animals. When water is in, oh, sorry, pardon me. When water is injected several times in succession without the acid. That deserves another whole discussion on its own. But basically, he was studying the frontal lobe. He understood that whatever was happening with extinction and conditioning and hypnosis was happening in the frontal lobe, because we can still live without it. We can still live with a stroke in the frontal lobe as well.
So Pavlov was conditioning and then deconditioning the dogs, and then maybe conditioning them again, and then deconditioning them. And he was doing this back and forth, and he was able to do that successfully. He was able to decondition the animals, but if he surgically removed the frontal lobe, he was no longer able to decondition them, and the conditioning was essentially permanent or semi-permanent.
Correct. Absolutely correct. Let's see if this can work. I don't know.
It looks like it's
Okay.
going.
Yay. For the study of the unconditioned elementary reflex, the salivary fistula is prepared in a dog. So there's the dog. I'm glad it's working. Oh, there you go. A funnel is attached to the fistula. Eating causes secretion of saliva. For those who can't see, the dog is eating. And then the amount of saliva is measured with a graduated cylinder. So there's the cylinder. These dogs are so aggressive. It says fresh bred. Um, I'm gonna just so here's the monkeys. Must have done it with monkeys too. You just and there so there's the child.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this, everything is hooked up to this poor little thing, and they are measuring everything. And out of this little instrument in front of his mouth will drop a little pellet. When his hand is stimulated, the child reacts by opening his mouth, the conditioned reflex. These poor little things. So I've, the conditioned reflexes may disappear and reappear again. So if you can't see, there's a little orphan child that's like maybe 4 or 5, or I don't know, 6. Um, and they have the child in a little booth, and he's all wrapped up, and there's a little tube that is dropping pellets into his mouth. And they are behind a screen, and and they have a little inflatable object on his wrist that they can inflate, and he's conditioned to open his mouth. So if they provide the stimulus with the food, which is a reinforcement, then the reflex to open his mouth is reestablished. This So they took these, and these, if you go and look for them, they are still on YouTube. So here they're using the metronome, and they just had a little screen that said they were using 150 is it a metronome? Strokes per minute. And that was the child was supposed to open his mouth. So they reproduced all of these experiments with the different stimuli in the children. Here's 78 strokes per minute. It might, there's the metronome. Okay. So now it's 78 strokes, and there it is playing. I'm just curious what they're going to put on the screen for this. I guess this is the complete differentiation of 150 from 78 strokes. In other words, the child was conditioned to learn the difference. With the 150, there was food coming. With the 78, there was no food coming. And I think that helps to just show what I was trying to say earlier. They were using metronomes with the dogs as well, right? And then when they would use the metronome, the inhibitory and the excitatory, one right after the other, it would create a mental pathology. Okay, so let's just see. So he observed and he wrote and lectured and experimented. But it wasn't until we really increased our understanding and our knowledge, and we had technology that could measure and also help us to understand what was the science behind the observations. So, for example, and I just want to make sure, uh, oh, I've gotten way ahead of myself. Ah, yes. Freud's nephew was Edward Bernays. I knew it would come to me. He wrote a lot. His book was called Propaganda. And in that is a short book, but he describes how to crowd control through the media. And back then, they had screens, but nothing like we have today.
Hmm.
And so all these people were involved. They based all their research, and everything we have today is like based on this research by Willem Wundt and Pavlov. And so here's Skinner, and then Edward Bernays, and now we have brainwaves experiments and so on.
Right,
So
because you've shown how Pavlov was a real person. He did these experiments on dogs, and these experiments did not stop with dogs. They extended to human beings. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Right? Like, why are they doing this? It's not for nothing, right? They're not spending all this time and money and
right.
energy just out of curiosity, right? There has to be some end in mind to utilize this. And I've read a little bit about it, and I know that the Soviet government was very interested in using the work that Pavlov did in a directed way towards the enemies of the Soviet Union. And I know that this wasn't there's a reason for this, right? So now that we've seen the extent to which it's gone, right? We've seen the extent to which he was able to condition people and hypnotize people and influence people in very dramatic and shocking and haunting ways, right? That footage is really, really haunting with the dogs and the children. I feel like I'm watching it from hell, when I'm watching these things. And but we see that these are very real things, right? And so that's when we have to ask the question, what was this used for? Right? What was this ultimately used for, and how is this still affecting us today? How does this apply to the things we experience today?
And we're in the middle of a grand experiment, is what I would posit. So, from a study on the gamma band, which we'll talk about a little bit more, we see this quote. As seen in the earlier slide, it's probably a slide that's coming. Our gamma wave flatlines when watching television. We're going to see that. This is because of the cuts, pans, and zooms in movies and television. Our brains do not see those as related sequences. This then flatlines our gamma wave, which then triggers involuntary attention. Anything after the trigger will be put into our memories as if hypnotized or experiencing trauma. So you have to remember then what happens is like a person can come to me with a stack of facts or the reality. This is ice water. I'm just going to react as if it's,
Mm-hmm.
boiling water. I'm going to react as if, I don't want to say too much, but I think we've seen in the last
Your
five
gamma
years.
waves are highly they're utilized a lot for your higher level reasoning and judgment and your ability to make sense of things, right? So when that's flatlined, it's similar to whenever he was doing Pavlov was doing experiments with trauma, right? Causing extreme excitatory stimuli, such as traumas and other things in order to condition, right? And these other things, they do the same thing, right? The cuts and pans and zooms from films and shows and the things we see on screens, these will flatline your gamma waves to make you extra vulnerable to whatever comes next, whatever is trying to be drilled into your psyche and your personhood.
Correct. And it's very difficult to undo those messages.
Hmm.
Behind me is my lovely father, Stuart Morris. He is enjoying this presentation as much as all of you. Here are the brainwaves and the drawings. So the first one has to do with studies. This is somebody drawing. Okay, brainwaves and drawing.
Hmm.
And you can see here we have this high beta. It's very active. The beta is active. I think that's alpha down there that you can't see. And then you have this gamma as the lowest one. It's also very active. It's short, so it doesn't go way up there like the high beta. So this is brainwaves and drawing. And we're going to go to the next slide. Now we see brainwaves in reading. So much less active. You're in a sort of state of alpha. So you look up here, your alpha is 1.53, and
And
your
so, and real quick, like what does the alpha and beta waves do?
when your alpha's flat, you're sort of sleeping. Like as Pavlov described hypnosis in excitatory sleep. When you're not being hypnotized, you're alpha, you're in deep alpha. And these low beta, beta, and high beta are all active when you're creating. And the gamma
Mm.
is at 1.18. So let's see what happens when you're reading. Everything goes down with the exception of the alpha. Look how the alpha is lower here during drawing. Very important to know what's happening with your brain when you're creating. So here you see the alpha is beginning to go up. Now you're getting into a semi-alpha state because you're reading, and the low beta has gone down, the beta has gone down, and the gamma has gone down to 0.23 from 1.18. That's reading. So we are told to be careful what we read and to, when you're reading, you have to be very intentional if you're going to be analytical about what you're reading. Is that true? Do I really believe that? But you can get into,
Right.
especially fiction and stories, where you're just into the whole story and it's all around you and you're so focused on the book that you can't hear the doors opening or closing or
Right.
maybe
This would
for
be
in
a very
school, the
low
kids getting
gamma
up and putting on
state,
their
right?
clothes. Yeah, well, right. So it's a lower gamma, and then your alpha is going up. Now, here's what happens when you're watching television. The alpha, so here your alpha was 2.16 in the reading. Here your alpha is 1.43, still very high, but your gamma is almost disappeared,
Mm.
0.06. So your gamma is flat the same way as if a car was in front of me. And so what tends to happen, especially with weaker minded people, is that you're forced, there's this involuntary attention to the screen. And of
Mm.
course, with little children, they don't stand a chance, right? They don't stand a chance. And
Because
it's
this is a
hard for
borderline hypnotic state.
Yes, it's a borderline hypnotic state. We call it, Pavlov would have referred to it as an excitatory sleep because
Okay.
you're not asleep, but it is like being asleep. And then you can sort of preach into the brain whatever you want, right? And so that's what's happening during television and movies and video games. There was a study that I read about video games and dopamine, and it said that it had the same effect as heroin, on the
Mm.
brain in that sense. And of course, it's going to have a similar effect with respect to the gamma here.
Yeah, because I think we've all been watching something at some point in our lives, and
Yes.
we know that we've kind of got into that state. I remember years ago, I think I was watching The Simpsons. I think I was
Uh-huh.
watching an episode of The Simpsons,
Uh-huh.
and I remember it was just like so. It was like a joke a minute, or like two jokes a minute. It's just like joke after joke, and like scene after scene, and crazy thing after crazy thing. And I wasn't even really laughing. It wasn't really that funny, but like I was just kind of like, you know, everything time kind of blurred, and it
Yeah.
wasn't wholly unpleasant, but it wasn't wholly pleasant either. It was just enough to keep me like stuck onto what I was watching to where I didn't have the will to kind of change it or turn it off because I was just in this whole other state. this whole other world, and I felt almost like mentally paralyzed by the stimulus.
Yeah, the medium. It's the medium, not the message, which is what was discovered in a study that was published in the Journal of American Journal American Medical Association, and it was from 1975, and they did a study on a town in Ontario. The town was called Notel, and for reasons that were technological, they didn't get television till 20 years after sort of the towns around them. So they were able to do a study on television's effect on violence. So in 1973, a small Canadian town acquired television for the first time. The acquisition of television at such a late date was due to problems with signal reception. So, in a double blind research design, a cohort of 45 first and second grade students were observed prospectively over a period of 2 years for rates of objectively measured noxious physical aggression. And I'm going to read another paragraph later on. Basically, I better say that the aggression rates among the children in Notel increased by 160%, right? And then they write, following the introduction of television into the United States, the annual white homicide rate increased by 93%, from 3.0 homicides per 100,000 white population in 1945 to 5.8 per 100,000 in 1974. In South Africa, where television was banned, the white homicide rate decreased by 7%, from 2.7 homicides per 100,000 white population in 1943 through 1948 to 2.5 per 100,000 in 1974. As with US whites following the introduction of television into Canada, the Canadian homicide rate increased by 92%, from 1.3 homicides per 100,000 population in 1945 to 2.5 per 100,000 in 1974. And the percentages sound really terrible until you get to it's like 1.3 homicides per, but over the years, it's steadily increased. Then the last thing that they write, or one of the last things that they write in this study, is this: to say that childhood exposure to television and television violence is a predisposing factor behind half of violent acts is not to discount the importance of other factors. Manifestly, every violent act is a result of an array of forces coming together: poverty, crime, alcohol and drug abuse, stress, of which childhood exposure to television is just one. Then it says these really shocking words: nevertheless, the epidemiologic evidence indicates that if, hypothetically, television technology had never been developed, there would today be 10,000 fewer homicides each year in the United States, 70,000 fewer rapes, and 700,000 fewer injurious assaults. And they
Wow.
did this study, and as I said, it was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1975. They didn't have the research. What they had said in here was it wasn't what the children watched. That wasn't what it was about. It was the medium itself, but they didn't understand it,
Mm.
right? And then as time went on and they were able to measure the frontal lobe, they found the gamma wave, and they realized what the mechanism behind television was. And as we discussed before, unrelated sequences required more attention 1 second after the cut. Attention. So this is when you, like, whatever you're putting in after the unrelated sequence, the brain is focused on that and it goes into the subconscious. And so this is a study published in April of 1993 in Communication Research, the effects of scene changes on semantic relatedness and attention to television. And it goes on to describe what we had described and summed up as the pans, the cuts, and the zooms are what is creating this involuntary attention that the brain is forcing. And attention to information presented after a cut will be greater than attention to information that is presented precisely on a cut. So they knew all of this. The advertisers have known all of this. They have exploited this to an nth degree, as you can tell when the advertisements come on. They're louder, they're more zingy, they're more bangy. Anyway, so the question is, how human are we without our frontal lobe? Because what is so wrong with that? What's so wrong with turning this off every so often? I'm stressed. So empathy disappears with the disappearing gamma. So there was a study done in a magazine called Neuropsychologia, volume 133, October 2019. And one of the quotes is, or subquotes, effective and cortical EEG gamma responses to emotional movies in women with high versus low traits of empathy. And it was found that a disappearing gamma wave affects your empathy, and you have you have ability to empathize. That's what happens when you don't have this frontal lobe, or you're not fully functioning gamma wave, right?
So you
So in,
broke up for a second there. Were you saying that low gamma wave activity it relates to lower levels of empathy?
yes. So in this study with the women, the present study sought to investigate how differences in trait empathy can influence emotional reactivity to a specific set of affective categories. They used 41 female students. They were shown movie clips, oddly enough, and then there were 4 emotional categories. And then the result was they suggest high empathy was associated with enhanced gamma activity and greater self-reported arousal to all emotional stimuli. Furthermore, in this group, scenes with crying characters prompted a distinct and localized cortical processing, which was much less with the women who were watching that had lower gamma activity. Trying to get this. There we go. So this is just, we wonder sometimes, where has our empathy gone? Where has the protest gone? You know, when we see freedom of speech, freedom of religion, you know, freedom disappearing, where has it gone? This is Singer in 2004 in the study. These studies showed that in response to the view of another person receiving painful stimulation, the viewer's brain regions involved in the processing of emotional features associated with painful experience were activated, although the participant did not receive themselves any actual stimulation. Moreover, individual differences in dispositional empathy modulate this activation, with people characterized by high levels of affective empathy showing the largest activation of the gamma wave during the vicarious experience of others' pain. So there's just sort of an unpacking and a breakdown
Did it
of
increase gamma
empathy.
wave activity when they were exposed to emotional stimuli and media?
I would have to read more of the study to give you that answer. I'd have to read more of the study to give you the answer. They were just measuring gamma and empathy. And so this was the message of the study, I guess.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't have that answer, but I can get it for you.
Mhm.
So this is, I won't show all of this either, but this is a gentleman, Phineas Gage. You may have heard of him. And he worked on the railroad. He was very reliable. He was a family man. He was religious. He very beautiful character, and he was also a supervisor. And he changed completely after there was an explosion and a rod, an iron rod, went up through his skull.
Oh,
And
this story. Okay, I've heard this before.
yes, yes. And I may skip through it if I think it's repetitive or too long, but just to make the point. Here we go.
And there's not supposed to be audio, is there? Because if
Did
there
you
is, we
say?
can't hear it.
Oh, there was no sound.
No, if there was audio, I couldn't hear it.
Oh, I'm really sorry. Okay, that's too bad. Um, Basically, it's just describing Phineas Gage and that he was working in Vermont. That in 1994, he died in 1886, and he in 1994, a husband and wife medical team uh, did an autopsy on his brain, and they were able to see where he had been damaged. So this gentleman, you can see the screen, right?
Yes.
I'm so sorry that there's no audio. I don't know how to get you audio. I'm sorry about that. The audio is up and you should be getting it. But anyway, this gentleman had a stroke in his frontal lobe, and he is with his therapist right now, and they're playing a game. And the game is really high risk. And he is disregarding risk, taking all kinds of financial risk. He doesn't grasp risk anymore. So with your gamma wave damaged, you don't have a grasp of risk and you're
Yeah,
not
because he had
risk
some like
averse.
it really intense damage, like something pierced his skull, right?
That was Phineas Gage. It was a rod that went through it.
Yeah, a
And that
rod went
was,
through his skull and it
yes,
damaged his frontal lobe. And then
yes,
ever since then, he functioned, but his personality totally changed. Like he became like a totally different person
yes.
and became like a
Thank you.
gambler and got into a lot of high risk activity. And where
Yes,
before he was like a very like gentle, soft-spoken,
right.
reserved kind of guy. And then he became very loud and gregarious and gambling and risk taking and crazy and kind of a jerk and didn't really know how to behave in social situations very well. Something like that, right? Is
Yes,
that about right?
exactly, exactly. And here's the 1994 picture of his brain. This was where the rod went through. It took out his frontal lobe. And so that's right. He left his family, he abandoned them, he took off, for 13 years he was just sowed to the wind, like, and then he died 13 years later. So that was very sad. So then this is another radiographic image of his brain, and you can see like the rod had gone where the rod had gone in. And then this is a neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio. And if you could hear him, he's talking about one of his patients who he had a stroke in the frontal lobe. And I think this person is the lawyer, and he was brilliant, did not lose his IQ. He worked with an amazing law firm that was very concerned for him. And after he recovered from the stroke in his frontal lobe, they hired him again, but he couldn't stay in the job because he would be sent to the library to do 15 minutes sort of worth or half an hour worth of research and to come back with the research. But he would be there like 5 hours because he just couldn't connect all the dots to
Mm.
to to isolate, that piece of research that they needed and bring it back. And he would just wander around. And that is what happened, losing his frontal lobe. And then this gentleman also had a frontal lobe stroke, and he did all kinds of activities prior to the stroke, but he isn't able to do anything after. So he's being shown pictures here, and so he is having a reaction to the pictures with no affect. So the picture that we just saw was a windmill, and he described it as, I'm looking at a windmill. Now he's looking at a picture of a child who's starving, and his description is the same affect as he was describing the windmill. I see a very thin child, a very, very thin child. There's no emotion, there's no empathy. He can describe it, but he can't connect all the dots with respect to what's happening. So this gentleman is now looking. This is a picture of an Auschwitz, somebody from Auschwitz. I hope
Hmm.
they're a survivor. And his description was, I see a very skinny person. I see a very, very skinny person. No affect, none at all.
Mm-hmm.
He describes this skater the same way he describes this person. If you can see, there's a car, it, and there's an explosion, and there is a gentleman in the fire. And his description was the same as the skater. I see a man burning, no emotion. This is what happens when we lose
Mm-hmm.
completely our gamma waves. It's just shocking to me in a sense that we're willing to slowly, by degrees approximate this, then, we should be trying to preserve our frontal lobe at all times. So here again are the slides. Then there's another patient. I don't know if you can see very clearly. This is the gentleman here, and he is playing a game with his therapist while his brain is being measured. And the game is one where you win by being risk adverse. And of course, he has no aversion to risk at all. And so he is constantly losing money, and they are
Mm-hmm.
measuring what's happening in his frontal lobe. And we talked about this when your frontal lobe is down because of alcohol. We have very little aversion to risk, and that's why they don't want us driving, you know, because we take risks that we normally wouldn't take if we weren't under the influence. And we also
Mm-hmm.
don't reason very well from cause to effect. Nothing's going to happen to me if I fly around that corner on the ice, at 150 miles an hour, 120 miles an hour, I'll be fine. This is the reasoning. That is different than IQ. IQ is typically not affected by damage to the frontal lobe. So people are still very intelligent. Furthermore, you can talk in a very intelligent way about things, but we have to know when we've had an excitatory sleep or inhibitory state, such as an alpha state or hypnosis, and something has been spoken into our subconscious. It's there in our subconscious with no moral filter, no filters at all. It's just there. And so that's why we have to be very careful and guard that. And also, the more that happens, the weaker our brain gets. So it doesn't matter if you're pumping in, you know, great stuff or not great stuff, we're cautioned against the effect of hypnosis on the brain. Even, a lot of people have used it to help with overcoming smoking and those kind of things. This gentleman is speaking, but we don't have the advantage. He's just explaining all of the different um, patients that he's had. So that have had strokes in the frontal lobe. Do you want to say anything?
Well, just from that we can see different examples of extreme cases where the frontal lobe is not functioning, right? We see extreme personality changes. We see total inability to make sound judgment. We see total disregard for risk and the inability to manage risk. We see the inability for pattern recognition and to connect dots that sometimes do need to be connected, and the inability to have an array of information and to put them all together into a unified picture. And we see all these elements of what happens when of overt examples of people who either had their frontal lobe destroyed in an accident or a stroke or some other incident where there was no gamma activity, there was no frontal lobe able to factor in into their life and their decision making. And we see extreme examples of exactly what the frontal lobe does, or when it's absent, what that looks like.
You know, that is a very good synopsis. And you, as you were speaking, you reminded me of a case that I believe was settled this year. It was a very old case, decades old. And you know that the institution of psychology used to treat depression, especially in women, by pissing the front in through here, and they would twist around here and scramble the
Sorry, say that
frontal
again. You
lobe.
broke up. They treated
And
depression in women by doing
oh,
what?
sorry, they would pith, pith the frontal lobe. So they would take a very sharp device like that and put it up here in between the eyes,
Oh wow.
go into the frontal lobe and pith it. It's like they would just ruin it, you know.
Oh wow.
And that was how they dealt with depression. Yes, and it was a thing. It was a thing. And so a case was settled. It was decades old. It was the estate. Obviously, she's long dead, but it was her, I think it was her grandchildren or her great grandchildren that were still litigating. And there was a settlement. Finally, there was a settlement because this woman, she was in Quebec and she into the institution for treatment of depression, and they pest her frontal lobe, and she came out like, you know, you come out without your personality, nothing. She
Hmm.
was she wasn't who she was when she went in. She wasn't the mother that went in. And they don't do that anymore. But the electric shock treatment therapy was very similar, you know. We've done all kinds of barbaric things in the name of treating mental illness, unfortunately.
Hmm.
But I'm just going to read this. This is a study that was in the journal Science Daily in 2008. Research into the adult brain has shown that gamma activity glue that binds together perceptions, thoughts, memories, notes Benecit. Little research, however, has been conducted into the development, I think is what they're saying, of gamma activity in the infant brain and its possible connection to cognitive and language skills. Benesic and her research team are the first to look at resting gamma power in the frontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, in children 16, 24, and 36 months old. In an article published online in an upcoming issue of Behavioral Brain Research, Benesic offers significant new insight into the likely role gamma activity plays in supporting emerging cognitive and language abilities in the first 36 months of life. I mean, anybody with children or planning to have children, and think about myself, you know, this is very telling. It's very significant. Gamma waves are fast, high frequency, rhythmic brain responses that have been shown to spike when higher cognitive processes are engaged. Research in adults and animals suggests that lower levels of gamma power might hinder the brain's ability to efficiently package information into coherent images, thoughts, and memories. However, until now, little has been known the developmental course of gamma power in children. Analyzing the children's electroencephalograms, Benesic and her research team found that those with higher language and cognitive abilities had correspondingly higher gamma power than those with poor language and cognitive scores. Similarly, children with better attention and inhibitory control, the ability to moderate or refrain from behavior when instructed, also had higher gamma power. There were no differences in gamma power based on gender or socioeconomic status. The measurements were obtained by placing a soft bonnet with 52 sensors on the heads of children as they sat on their parents' lap and quietly played. As suspected, the group of children with a family history of language impairments showed lower levels of gamma activity. So they are doing research and they do know a lot more than they used to know.
Right. So this also affects inhibition as well and our ability to refrain from negative behaviors. So your
Correct.
frontal lobe and the amount of gamma that you have active at a time at any given time is directly proportional to your ability to refrain from bad behaviors or temptations or things you know you shouldn't do.
Correct. And if you're a grade one teacher, it's a difference between all the children be able to sit in their desk and, that maybe one or two that are wandering around the classroom and they just can't seem to sit still. And it's like I said, a hot breakfast isn't going to help them. Uh, so here's what Benesic says. We believe that the maturation of the brain mechanisms that support gamma activity and those critical for mounting normal language and cognitive development may be occurring simultaneously. We seem to have identified a window during a period of sustained and dramatic linguistic and cognitive growth that can help us better determine where a child is developmentally, right? So then we'll bump down to this next highlight. These latest findings appear to show that the emergence of strong gamma activity is critical for linguistic and cognitive development, and that children at risk for language impairments may lag in this respect. Like, you think about all of the children on screens right now, this is what's happening, and they don't know the effect. Having strong bursts of gamma activity appears to assist the brain in making the neural connections for effective language development, right? By measuring gamma activity in the frontal cortex, which is the last brain area to mature and is used to make decisions and solve problems, we may be able to tell how well the brain is developing in general. And then if you drop down again to this highlight, from 16 to 36 months, there's a dramatic explosion of linguistic and cognitive growth. Children rush headlong into language, rapidly developing their skills, increasing from a vocabulary of 100 words to 1,000 words, learning that words stand for objects and that words not only are associated with a specific object, that categories such as dog represent not just a single animal, but all dogs. So the gamma wave is so important. And I'm just going to skip that slide. So in Scientific American, February 2002, there was an article, a very long one, entitled Television Addiction is No Mere Metaphor. And in it, it says that television is an addiction because of the medium and that we're put into a alpha state or semi-alpha state by watching television. So they said the amount of time people spend watching television is astonishing. On average, individuals in the industrialized world devote 3 hours a day to the pursuit, fully half of their leisure time, and more than any single activity save work and sleep. At this rate, someone who lives to 75 would spend 9 years in total in front of the tube,
Wow.
which is a very shocking statistic. In our studies, the longer people sat in front of the set, the less satisfaction they said they derived from it, but the harder it was to get up. In 1986, there was a Stanford University study, and they studied whether the simple formal feature of cuts, edits, zooms, pans, sudden noises activated the orienting response. thereby keeping attention on the screen. You can't stop watching. By watching how brainwaves were affected by formal features, the researchers concluded that these stylistic tricks can indeed trigger involuntary responses and derive their attentional value through evolutionary significance of detecting movement. It is the form, not the content of television that is unique, right? The orienting response may partly explain common viewer remarks such as, if a television's on, I just can't keep my eyes off it. Not everybody has this response, but most of us do. Increasing the frequency of edits, defined here as change from one camera angle to another in the same visual scene, improved memory recognition, presumably because it focused attention on the screen. So whatever you watched, you remembered it more when there were screen changes. Increasing the frequency of cuts had a similar effect, but only up to a point. If the number of cuts exceeded 10 times in 2 minutes, recognition dropped off sharply. But increasing the rate of cuts and edits eventually overloads the brain. And the orienting response is overworked, but not, you still don't lose habituation. So they basically said, try to watch less television. that's really what they said in that study. And then
Seven to
we
nine
read
years in front of the television. That's shocking. And honestly, when was the study done? What year?
um, 2002. It's
2002.
this
And that's only
Scientific
gone up.
American.
That's only
That's
gone up
gone up because of the phones. We didn't
dramatically.
really have phones in 2002, right?
Right. To back then in 2002, in order to watch, media entertainment, you had to actually go to the television and sit down in front of it and turn it
Right.
on.
Or the
Now,
movie
now
theater.
you have your television with you all the time.
Have
It's
it with
another
you.
appendage, right? It's in your pocket, and
Whenever
it's
you're bored.
right. And then, there's so many parents out there who, I understand people get stressed. There's a
Right.
lot of single
Right.
parent homes now. We live in
Yes.
a world where there's so many broken families, and there's not two parents in the home, and
Right.
parent may get overwhelmed, and their solution may be like, well, I've been at work all day, I'm tired,
Right.
let me just give my child a tablet and then
Well, I
just
make dinner.
right, and like that'll quiet them down
Yeah.
while
And it
I
does.
while I do whatever it is I need to do, right? And it works, right? But it works for this reason, right? Because it puts them in a semi-hypnotized state. But, that's not without consequence, right? That's
That's
not
right.
without consequence. There's significant damage that is being done to the child's development and their ability to form their frontal lobe properly and to exercise having stronger gamma waves, which is going to affect, forever their ability to make sound judgments and to reason and to weigh risks properly and to have a moral guidance and judgment and discernment, right? And these are all hyper
Cognition,
critical,
empathy,
important things, right?
our people, who we are. Yes, very well. Thank you so much for saying exactly how you said it.
Yeah, and then when you see
So
the
in 2000,
programs that children are
yes.
watching, because I forget when it was, maybe a year ago, someone sent me something that was just so shocking to me. It was like these weird things that kids watch, like, and there's a term for it, on TikTok and stuff. They call it brain rot, and because that's really what it is. It's a very apt slang term for what it is. They call it brain rot, and that's what it is. The kids are just watching brain rot. It's just random. It's kind of funny, but it's not like funny to where like it's compelling. It's just funny enough to keep you glued to it, and there's
Yeah.
so much stimuli that's kind of funny, and it's more of amusing that you're just glued to it, and it's just so absurd and ridiculous and over the top and violent and sexual and crazy and insane and colorful, and then this is
Little.
happening and then what,
Yeah.
it's so hyper stimulating. And yeah, as a kid, yeah, you're going to be totally mesmerized by this stuff. I got mesmerized
Exactly.
by it just by watching it just to see
Stand
what it
a
was.
chance. You don't stand a chance. Children don't stand a chance. Exactly so. I would too. And this is what is shaping normative value. It's taking over from the parents, from family, and it is even taking over to a great extent from what's happening in the classrooms, education. It is the main factor with respect to shaping normative values. And what are they learning, as you said? Brain rot. In
Right.
2009, yeah, in 2009, the Daily Telegraph published that Australia had banned screens for tots under 2. So that meant you could be shut down if you were a daycare and you had children under the age of 2 in a room with the computer or the television on. And I believe there's a country in the Netherlands, I think it's Sweden, but basically, if somebody reports parents that they have the television on in the home with young children in front of it, they can have their children removed. So
Mm.
some countries have taken it very seriously.
Right, right. So it
But
goes to show there's large authoritative bodies that see the damage that these things cause, and whether their response to it is
right,
appropriate or not. We see that there's
exact.
people, people, governments, organizations, people know what this does. And in fact, even a lot of people know this by now. Steve Jobs famously never let his no devices in the home. Didn't want his kids or using iPads and phones and things like this because he saw himself like what these things do. He was acutely aware of the power of these things and what these things did, and he did not allow his children to use these devices in his own family.
Wow. I think there are other really famous people who have said and done the same thing. But I didn't know that about Steve Jobs. That's very telling. Um, Much of Soviet psychology is concerned with adaptations of the conditioned reflex concept of Pavlov, one fundamental aspect of which is belief that men can deliberately be made to develop pre-designed types of thought and behavior under appropriately controlled environmental conditions. Just think about a movie theater, and now, as you said, the phones are with us everywhere we go, and there's always about this far away from our face. And so I feel like we're living in a Pavlovian world. This is post Pavlov. Um, if I can get this. And the first motion picture was in 1888, so we've had it for a while. It was a little over 2 seconds. And here it is. Whoops. I guess I couldn't get the video, but the video is on YouTube. If you look for it, it's there. The Round Bay Garden scene, and they just have these people walking for about 2 seconds. So that was 1888. Oops. Uh, so in hypnosis, all activities based on imitation are accentuated, and we see revealed the long submerged reflex, which in all of us in childhood forms and develops the complicated individual and social behavior. Similarly, some change of the environment, which in former days has repeatedly evoked certain movements affecting certain analyzers, in hypnosis calls forth without fail, and in a stereotyped manner, the old response. And like I said, that can be undone. We were so much a product of, as we talked about, nature versus nurture, right? And what we're exposed to. Notwithstanding all the reason and rationality and facts, hypnosis calls forth without fail and in a stereotyped or automatic manner the old response. This accounts for the large and practically insurmountable influence of suggestion as a stimulus during hypnosis, as well as shortly after it. The command retains its effect after the termination of hypnosis, remaining independent of other stimuli, being impermeable to them. Since at the time of primary introduction of the stimulus into the cortex, it was prevented from establishing any connection with the rest of the cortex. That's just simply not how God works. He just doesn't work that way. And we have to beware. My goal in this research and sharing this research is to warn us all, be careful. You were describing not being able to turn away, and I think a lot of us feel that way about our phones, like flipping through Facebook, even like research that I've been doing, and I'm not finding what I want, and it's like from page to page, even a print, it has that same effect. That feeling like I want to stop this. This is going nowhere. I can't stop this. Or flipping through pictures, even, flip, 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 like that, and posts, that kind of thing, I think entangles us in the same way. And the last research that I had mentioned excessive internet video game playing, and this was research that was published in a Journal of Addict Medicine in September 2007. Excessive internet video game play has emerged as a leading cause of behavioral and developmental problems in adolescents. And there was some research done in universities, and the question was, where did all the boys go? Because it's so many females that have taken over, even in the maths and the sciences. And they then pan to a picture of the young fellows in front of video games. Internet addiction is a distinct entity within the addictive disorders and continues to be the subject of debate. However, excessive internet use has been reported to be comorbid with functional impairments such as major depressive disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. The dopamine system has been known to be involved in learning, reinforcement of behavior, attention, and sensory motor integration. So all these things are coming together. And also in this study, they indicated that video gameplay had the same effect or similar effect on the brain as a heroin addiction. And all of these things are converging together. And in some sense, they are all based on this initial research and these observations of Pavlov in Russia, Wilhelm Wundt in Germany. There were sort of several all discovering this at the same time. And it has only become more and more sophisticated as time has gone on. A warning to all of us. Thank you for listening. You have been an amazing host and colleague. Thank you very much, Davie.
Yeah, thank you for all that, Grace. That was a very powerful presentation because we see how this research that started with Pavlov didn't just stop with dogs, and it didn't just stop with even the orphan children and the other people that he experimented on, but this research has been extended and used not just in the 20th century, but is very much with us today. And it's we politicians use it and governments use it and media companies use it and people who develop phones and video games and movies and all these things, they use all these same tools that Pavlov was originally working on in order to make us more suggestible, to put us into these low gamma states, these quasi or almost totally hypnotic states, and they're feeding us information and thoughts and ideas that are not our own. And by the time it gets inside of us, we may not even remember where we picked this up from, right? We may not even remember where we picked up these behaviors from. We may not even remember where we picked up these opinions from. We may not remember where we picked up these ideologies and these worldviews from. I remember there was this, I don't remember his full name. It was Yuri something. He was an ex-KGB operative, and he referred to it as ideological subversion, and how there was a an overt intelligence operation used to change people's minds and their ideologies and their worldviews to the extent to where no matter what, a person who is sufficiently brainwashed and exposed to the things that they used in the media to change people's ideologies and worldviews, that once they were sufficiently brainwashed in such a way that no matter what you showed them, no matter what facts, no matter what evidence, no matter what videos you could show them, of video footage to the contrary of what they believe in, and they would still reject the information. They would still refuse the information because they were so the ideology was embedded so deep into them through these same means, through these Pavlovian mind control, suggestibility, hypnotic techniques. It was embedded so deeply inside of them by bypassing the frontal lobe, bypassing the gamma waves, and by bypassing those things and ingraining them so deeply in a person that no matter what you showed them to the contrary, they would reject the information, they would refuse the information. And so those are things that are actively happening to us all the time, right? These are things that whenever we're watching, because people now, if we get our news, we get it from places like YouTube and Twitter and, social media. And these mediums are specifically designed to put us in these states where we're hyper suggestible because that's just the nature of the medium. The nature of the medium makes us hyper suggestible to this content, and we get, our ideas of what's happening in the world from these things, and we get all these different, talking heads and thought leaders who give us information on these mediums and tell us what to think and how to feel about certain situations. And we're exposed to violent and sexual and create all sorts of ideological media in video games and movies all the time. And we may not realize that these things are
Right.
affecting us and these things are changing us. And it may not be obvious how they are, right? But they are, and they're using these mechanisms, right? They're using these mechanisms to flatline and deaden the gamma waves so that they can bypass our critical reasoning faculties and embed themselves deeply inside of us. And we may not realize, in fact, we won't realize that those things are happening, but they'll be
Right.
happening all the same. So you did a great job of really walking us through the history of that and how those things are operating on a physiological level in our brains and how those things are really extending out into the politics, the media, and all these things. So when we see people behaving, we see the madness of crowds. We see people out in groups acting to the contrary of what their best interests really are. People who are otherwise very
True.
intelligent people, right? People who have jobs where that's required to have to think on their feet, and they have to be very witty and smart and apt. Even these people, right? These people who seem so brilliant in their respective fields, even they are often being swayed to do things that seem
So
to be
true.
quite foolish or things that are
So
really
true.
to the contrary of what seems very obvious. Like this seems very obvious. This is not the way to go. This seems obviously bad. And even very bright people will still fall for those things and go in that direction. And it's
Right.
because of these techniques, right? It's because the
Yes.
way these things are being embedded in them is bypassing their higher thinking
Reasoning.
abilities
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
really embedding them deep into a part of their brain that by this point they have very little control over by this point. And so I think you did a really great job of walking us through how that's happening. So thanks
Thank
again,
you.
Grace. Thank you. If
Thank
thanks
you.
again for presenting that. And if is there anything else you'd like to leave us with before we go?
I thought you wrapped it up really well, Davie. I think we're in the middle of a war. I'm very concerned about the next generation as we talked. With everything digitizing and the transhumanist movement and so on, I just see us going to the next level, which really uh, we all need to be watching for that and defending ourselves against that. And we need prayer to pull that cover of protection over us that Jesus has promised.
Mm, amen. Amen. Yeah, well, these are troubling times, so we really need to be guarding our hearts and be very careful about the things that we're willingly exposing ourselves to. So thanks again,
So
Grace. That
true.
was that was really excellent. And thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for joining us
Yes.
on this latest episode of Our Beloved Church, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks again everyone for watching. Take
Thank
care
you.
and God
Good night.
bless.
God bless. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope that you enjoy the program and that you will like and subscribe. Especially consider sharing with your friends if you found this information to be helpful. God bless, and we'll see you the next time.